Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone at the seminar organized by the Richard Pipes Laboratory, which operates in the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. My name is Wojciech Łysek, and I am the secretary on this project. Before we start, I would like to encourage you to apply for submission on the 5th conference of the Richard Pipes Laboratory. It will be held at November. Individual submission is open until the end of March. I'm glad to start the seminar. Today we will discuss around the book, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled History, Diverging States. Hence, it is a pleasure to welcome the author of the book, one of the authors, Professor Maria Popova from McGill University. The discussion will be led by Dr. Alejandra Spalinska from Institute of Political Studies. I wish all participants an interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to give the floor to Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And indeed, welcome everybody to our seminar on the Entangled Histories and Diverging States in the context of Russian-Ukrainian war, their relationship, and their potential futures. Today, our speaker is Professor Maria Popova and one of the authors of the book. And our discussion will be structured around 4 questions that I will be asking one after another to facilitate the discussion. After Maria's presentation, we will open the floor to the audience, and everyone participating will be able to ask a question and voice their comments. The first question about the book is, Maria, could you introduce us to the theoretical framework of your book, Historical Entanglements and the Logic of Divergence in Case of Ukraine and Russia?
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure for me to represent the 2 co-authors of this book. I'll start by a little sort of disclaimer of sorts that the most historical discussion in the book was Oksana's purview. And mine was the more contemporary chapters of it. So I won't go too deep into the historical entanglement, but I will, of course, explain the theoretical framework and the logic that we try to put forward. Before I do that, I wanted to sort of give you a sense of really sort of what motivated us to write this book. Very soon after the full-scale invasion started, we really started thinking about this and writing it in the summer of 22. And it came from the general frustration with how dominant the idea was that the Russia-Ukraine war that we were witnessing was really the result of the international system, a geopolitical argument about NATO expansion, about the wrangling and the geopolitical competition between Russia and the West. And sort of the emphasis was that this is really almost a war that's not really about Ukraine. It's a war in which, as you know, some people are really drawn to the idea that Ukraine is simply a proxy of the West here. So this is really just a West-Russia confrontation that happens to take place in Ukraine. And what we wanted to do in this book was really to push back against this geopolitical argument that was so dominant, and actually look into how the domestic politics in both Russia and Ukraine are really the key to understanding this conflict, the key to understanding why Russia invaded Ukraine first in a limited fashion in 2014 and in 22 in a full-scale fashion. So what we thought is the key to understanding this process was what we called the escalatory cycle between Ukraine's commitments to its independent statehood that started out in 1991 at somewhat lower level and increasing over time, versus Russia's commitment to re-imperializing the area, sort of binding Ukraine back to itself, which also started at a lower level and intensified over time. So what we argue is that these two commitments interacted with each other over time in this escalatory cycle, meaning that the more Ukrainians committed to their independence, the more Russia pushed to re-imperialize the area and bring Ukraine back to the Russian world idea. But the more Russia pushed, the more this actually intensified Ukrainian commitment to their independent statehood. And the two processes eventually led or gradually led to significant divergence between the two states, divergence in terms of identity, divergence in terms of regime type, eventually also geopolitical divergence, but sort of as the third element of this divergence rather than the only and the leading element of it. So what we argue started this escalatory cycle. In order to identify sort of the origins, we go back to the last years of the Soviet Union and the way in which Russia and Ukraine emerged as independent states from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we argue that the escalatory cycle really starts from the very beginning with a sort of tacit, not really out in the open, but de facto misunderstanding between how Russian elites and society and Ukrainian elites, to a lesser extent society, but eventually society as well, understood the collapse of the Soviet Union. You may be aware that after Ukraine voted overwhelmingly in 91 for independence with over 90% of the vote, and elected President Leonid Kravchuk to the presidency of independent Ukraine in the run-up to the Belovezh Accords that disbanded the Soviet Union. President Kravchuk famously called the disbanding of the Soviet Union a civilized divorce. But to continue with this wedding type of partnership analogy, what we argue in the book and show is that at the time, Yeltsin and broadly speaking, Russian elites didn't in fact see the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a divorce in which the partners go their separate ways, they're no longer in any sort of partnership, but as rewriting of the vows. Basically, the idea that the Soviet Union as a structure, as a vessel for the Russia-Ukraine relationship didn't work. It had to be disbanded, but there would be another way, another vessel, another form, another vows, if you will, in which Russia and Ukraine would continue to be bound together. And this sort of misunderstanding really launches this escalatory cycle because Ukrainian elites at that point are operating with the idea that they are in charge of an independent state. We talk about the so-called grand bargain that emerges in the Ukrainian political spectrum. It's a coalition between the the national Democrats on the right of Ruch, who want to pursue sort of a Baltic model of immediate distancing as far as possible from Russia, and building of a Ukrainian nation as an independent, distinctive European nation. They have a coalition with some centrist former communists, apparatchiks, who are not necessarily committed to these ideologically, to these national Ukrainianization ideas, but they are committed to governing an independent state, to being in charge of the resources of that independent state. So the two groups end up governing Ukraine because they have a majority. And what we see is that from the very start, in Russia, there is the assumption that Ukraine's independent statehood might be either short-lived, potentially, or might be formal, but at the same time, Ukraine and Russia would be bound together in a common economic, political, defense, cultural space. And this kind of push and pull continues over time and intensifies over time by pushing the grand bargain Ukrainian elites further and further from Russia and from the idea of a close binding between Russia and Ukraine. So Kuchma, for example, demonstrates this process, this gradual process quite well. He starts out as a candidate who appeals to sort of the pro-Russian part of the Ukrainian electorate. So he gets elected against the national Democrats, who are trying to take Ukraine further away from Russia. So he gets elected on this kind of platform, but once he starts governing, he finds himself having to defend Ukrainian independence and the independent sort of path forward for Ukraine from various types of Russian pressure and encroachment. He ends up writing a book entitled "Ukraine is Not Russia." And during his second term in the famous Tuzla incident, which is sort of a rather tense moment of confrontation between Russia and Ukraine over an island in the Kerch Strait called Tuzla, where incidentally today the Kerch Bridge is anchored in that island. So it's a tiny island that territorially belongs to Ukraine. But in 2003, Russia starts building this dam and basically unilaterally announces that this island in fact belongs to Russia. And at that point, Kuchma takes a very strong stance, orders some military exercises to show that Ukraine is ready to defend this island. He goes to Moscow and he gives an interview to Izvestia, and he says, basically, his words are, the more you build this dam, the more our mood is with Europe and with the West, as a warning to Russia that if they keep pushing, Ukraine will have to balance somehow and move away even more away from Russia, diverge more from Russia. So that's how the escalatory cycle over time produces increasing regime divergence between the two states. Ukraine gradually democratizes, and Russia gradually returns to authoritarianism and consolidates it. Ukraine gradually moves to a distinctive definition of Ukrainian identity that has Ukraine, envisions Ukraine as a separate, distinctive European nation rather than as a branch of a tripartite Russian nation with Ukraine and Belarus as the little brothers in that relationship. Whereas on Russia's side, we have an increasing commitment to this narrative of the Ukrainian nation belonging to a greater Russian world, and this is the type of process that sets up the two states on a collision course that first comes to a head in 2014, and then between 2014 and 22, when the divergence grows and becomes even more pronounced, we end up with Russia deciding that in order to bridge this divergence, the only choice is to launch this full-scale invasion and just end Ukrainian statehood altogether. So the point of the argument is to bring analytically the attention back on Russia and Ukraine, rather than and explain how, in fact, there's a deeper process here which determines the divergence and determines the outcome, and the geopolitical divergence, which got so much overstressed, is in fact one of the later results of this process rather than the cause of it.
Okay, thank you for this explanation. Brilliant. Your book is indeed very interesting, and what struck me during reading it was that actually how much we need the kind of new language, the language of comparative politics and post-colonial studies rather than IR, to actually understand the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and consequently to craft better security policies in Europe. And yes, I think that it's very interesting that also your theoretical framework was very interesting for me, because it kind of shows that we really need this kind of separate approach to study post-imperial relations. And especially I like the concepts of imperialization of Russia and vassalization of Ukraine, how they interact with each other, and how actually we can measure the escalation in their relationship precisely based on these variables. So it's not like this is some kind of difficult to understand Eastern Europe issue. It's absolutely feasible to examine with the conceptual apparatus from the comparative politics. And maybe taking this in a little different direction, do you have any impressions of how your book was received in this specific context, in the context of that you're more from comparative politics and you're using this language rather than IR?
Yeah, very interesting question. And I think, I mean, we don't really have systematic data on this, but it seems to us that the IR field is in fact quite resistant to this pushback, and it seems that despite the 3 years of stressing that both Russia and Ukraine have agency in this process, it is their domestically determined decisions that drive the process. It is their reaction to each other's behavior that is then driving the divergence that we talk about. Despite all of this, which you know, we think there is so much evidence for the fact that both countries are evaluating sort of how the other reacts and perceives them and are acting on these perceptions. Despite all of that, we still, I think, see in IR the geopolitical wrangling argument almost dominant. I mean, I still see my international relations colleagues teaching Mearsheimer as even though it seems that he has been completely disproven by events. The whole idea that Russia's insecurity is driving this behavior has really been falsified completely by Putin shrugging off the Finland and Sweden NATO accession and saying, well, it's okay for them to enter NATO because we don't have the historical and cultural problems with them that we have in Ukraine. I mean, in what other way do you expect to hear from Putin that this is not about security but about imperialism, right? Even in that situation, we still see the international relations field as a whole sort of clinging to this idea that it's about spheres of influence, that it's about great power competition, that Russia is reacting to the United States. Now, even if, I mean, that's the shocking part. Now that we see this major pivot by the United States, why is the war not immediately over? Right? If the goal was pushing back against the US, Russia pushing back against the US, here's the US abandoning Ukraine de facto, sort of taking all of Russia's considerations into all of Russia's concerns into consideration, saying basically, we have Trump saying, well, yeah, NATO shouldn't have expanded, the war shouldn't have happened, all of that. Why is the war not over? Well, because Russia continues to have goals in Ukraine. Not goals vis-a-vis the US, goals in Ukraine that it cannot accomplish because of, again, because of Ukraine, not because of the US, not because of the US's policies. And the realists are having a really hard time understanding this moment. That's why we have Graham Allison, for example, writing an op-ed saying Zelensky needs to accept this difficult and unjust peace, without for a second asking himself, why is Zelensky not doing it? Is it that Zelensky does not understand the stakes and the situation? No, of course not. Of course, he understands the superficial description that Graham Allison has in his foreign policy article. Of course, he understands it, but he is not taking this advice. Why? Because that's not where the Ukrainian electorate is. That's not where Ukraine, in this case, has agency, as always, is not an American proxy. Americans can give all the advice they want, but Ukraine is going to act on its national interest, how it defines that national interest. And in order for us to understand this, we really need to look inside the domestic political dynamics. And if we do that, what we see immediately is that there is consensus still in Ukraine that it is not worth submitting to what they know is Russia's desire for full political domination, and Russia's desire to erase their sovereignty, a desire that Russia talks about constantly and is not hiding. So, so the fact that Ukraine is making this choice is completely lost on the IR paradigm. The IR paradigm seeks to seeks or arrives through theoretical means at what Ukraine should be doing. And when Ukraine is not doing that, they're stumped. And all they can do is give advice rather than understand.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, brilliant. And it's indeed very interesting. And I think that the case of this war really shows the shortcomings of IR, not only the realism, but IR in general, because it's not only about the realism, it's also about the language that is being used in the policy cycles, for example. And now I think that we don't need just to improve our understanding of this specific case. We actually need the paradigm shift in well, security studies in general, from basically from realism to, well, to more, I think, more field oriented, more more empirical language drawn from the studies such as yours, that actually would help to understand the behaviors not only of great powers in the relationship between them, like Russia and the US, but actually the resistance against the great powers and the agency of small states. Of course, in quotation mark, because Ukraine is not small, by the way. So I think that we need basically this kind of linguistic shift. And it's, I think it's also interesting how the matter of language corresponds with the what you've mentioned, what was kind of symbolic balancing, like in the case of this Kerch issue. And my question would be here: did you find any similar cases of the symbolic balancing, and how it moved forward from symbolic kind of symbolic spat to more significant culminating points and pivots in this Russian-Ukrainian relationship recently?
Yeah, what we trace in the book is several critical junctures at which Russian domestic politics could have evolved differently, and in that way taken a trajectory that potentially averts war, and also Ukrainian critical junctures at which, again, a different potential outcome could have dramatically altered the trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine relationship. So in the book, we have a few counterfactuals. This is something that people kind of try not to go into because it's always, of course, a tricky thing to do. It is speculative, but we thought that it really was necessary in order to show that nothing is we are absolutely not arguing that this war was somehow inevitable. There were many opportunities in which it could have been averted and things could have turned out differently. There is nothing set in stone about about Russia's re-imperialization efforts. Nothing set in stone about how Ukraine has arrived at its current very strong commitment to independent statehood, that it's a contingent process and an iterative process that really depends on various decisions taken on both sides. So in the Ukrainian case, we discussed two potential critical junctures and pivots, and they're, in the Ukrainian case, they're quite obvious. They're the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan. And in both cases, we have the same outcome, which is what we actually observed was a democratic breakthrough in the Orange Revolution. It was sort of the establishment of a precedent that elections are going to be, fair elections, and a fairly counted outcome of the elections is going to be the way in which power is going to be determined in Ukraine. And so the Orange Revolution is a democratizing moment in which basically Ukraine shifts from the competitive authoritarianism of the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, to a system in which everybody knows that democratic elections are going to be the way to transition power, but there's of course a lot more work to be done in order to increase the quality of democracy. But this is an important moment for Ukraine. It's an important moment identity-wise as well, because it's a moment in which basically the side that wanted that had the distinctive Ukrainian identity conception, that's the side that won the elections and won the confrontation as well. And so it led to a jump in and an expansion of the proportion of Ukrainians who identified later on with that side. So it's both a democratizing and an identity building moment. And we have data in the book that really illustrates how the Orange Revolution is a fork in the road for Ukraine in terms of democratization. Things really take off. And unfortunately, at the same time, that particular moment is a fork in the road for Russia as well, because what we see is that after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Putin regime in Russia reacts with a number of policies that in fact lead to the consolidation of an authoritarian regime in Russia in response to the Orange Revolution. The sort of the paranoia that a color revolution might spread to Russia. This is the moment at which this is a reasonable argument to make. It is really feasible for at that moment for a color revolution to take place in Russia as well, in response to manipulated elections. So we see that the Putin regime takes a number of measures to sort of color revolution proof itself. There is the cancellation of gubernatorial elections altogether. That happens literally immediately after the Orange Revolution in December of 2004. There are all of these court cases against potential leaders of such a revolution. We have the Khodorkovsky case that kind of goes on overdrive precisely after the Orange Revolution, even though at that point Khodorkovsky is already in prison, but he is eventually convicted. There is a crackdown on independent media. There's a crackdown on civil society. There's really a strong reaction in Russia to the Orange Revolution. Euromaidan is another, of course, pivotal moment. Oh, but before I get to that, the point about the critical juncture is that the Orange Revolution, of course, could have turned out differently. I mean, the easiest thing to imagine is that Yushchenko could have actually died from the dioxin poisoning. And if he had died from the poisoning, it is unlikely that he could have been replaced by someone who could have won with the same sort of margin. It's not super likely that Tymoshenko would have won the election with the same margin, and it is possible that Yanukovych would have taken office right then and there, started building an authoritarian regime. Obviously, the precedent of losing the opportunity to have free and fair elections, but sort of accepting that regimes can manipulate elections would have led to dampening of civil society strength if they had failed. So we could imagine that at that point, the divergence between Russia and Ukraine would have been bridged. A Yanukovych government in 2005 could have adopted all the politics of memory and all of the national identity and language laws that Russia wanted for Ukraine, and much of this divergence could have been stopped in its tracks there. So that's why this is a critical juncture moment. In the earlier critical juncture moment in Russia is the Yeltsin-Putin transition. And what we go through in the book is this counterfactual that maybe someone else rather than Putin could have taken over from Yeltsin. But it's not so much about the person necessarily, though obviously it does seem that if somehow we could have had Nemtsov take over from Yeltsin rather than Putin, things may have gone in a very different direction. He was one of the Russian politicians that was the most committed to the idea of de-imperialization and sort of pursuing an identity conception of Russia, of a Russian nation within its borders rather than bigger than its borders. But it's not necessarily about the person, but what the argument that we make is that had Russian political competition survived the Yeltsin, beyond the Yeltsin era, and had we had another Russian president who tolerated different factions competing for his attention, right? And had more opportunities for different factions to solidify their political power and sort of develop an electorate that would be committed and would maintain political competition, even if it wasn't necessarily, even if nobody was pushing a de-imperialization agenda in a very meaningful way, we would still have a lower chance of this consolidation around the idea of re-imperialization, because there would have been different ideas about how to achieve this new relaunched sort of rewritten vows in which Ukraine and Russia would still be bound together. We would have Chubais pushing the liberal empire idea. We would have others, nationalists pushing for all-out invasion, but there would be competition, and the result of that competition would be that the most sort of the policies of pressure and the escalation of these re-imperialization policies towards Ukraine would have been much lower, and as a result, the processes within Ukraine of distancing and diverging from Russia would not have been so strong as well. And that could have led to a bridging and a type of relationship between the two countries that is indeed akin to sort of a common political defense cultural space, which nonetheless maintains the sovereignty of the two independent states. So that's what we think is one of the critical junctures in which Russia could have taken a different path, but didn't. And we have what we have. And in the 2010s, the two critical junctures, again, are Euromaidan in Ukraine, which of course we know is also a democratizing and identity building moment. But before that, we have in Russia, the 2011 protests that sort of signaled a possibility of political competition, sort of the last breath, if you will, of political competition in Russia, where if the protests had been more successful and there would have been some sort of constrained signal that the Russian president can be constrained and competition can make a comeback, would have again altered the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the counterfactual that we pursue is that Yanukovych, during his presidency, may have been more effective in vassalizing and participating in the vassalization of Ukraine. He did make some steps towards it, but he was sort of not necessarily, he wasn't making all the steps in that direction. He was at the same time still trying to pursue this multi-vector policy from the Kuchma years. He did try to pursue the association agreement initially, reneged only after significant pressure from Russia. At that point, Putin's hold on power is well consolidated because the 2011-12 wave of protests is over and he is reelected. He is safe. So that's a moment in which things might have turned out differently if Yanukovych had succeeded in clamping down on Maidan, had succeeded in staying in power. That could have led to some more effective bridging of this divergence between the two countries. But because that didn't happen, we have the beginning of military aggression by Russia against Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for these insights and telling us about your research in that context. And now, could you tell us something about your newest endeavors on the escalatory cycle in the Russian behavior towards its targets? And can your theory be applied to other cases than Russia and Ukraine?
So this is what we're trying to do now, is to take this escalatory cycle idea and sort of think about answering the question of, is this really unique to the Russia-Ukraine relationship? Or is this generalizable to Russia's relationship with other former Soviet states, but also with any of its potential vassals, so to speak? And we're in the beginning stages of that particular project. But what we're thinking about right now is that what we are interested in here is sort of exploring the application of this theory to other cases, with the goal of understanding sort of the risks that lie ahead, and the trajectories that we've already observed, some of which we sort of take for granted. Some of these trajectories, we sort of take for granted at this point that the Baltics are in NATO and the EU, safely protected from Russian intervention. But the question is, how did that happen? Because I think, again, this is a very contingent process. It may have turned out very differently, had different contingency, sort of at different critical junctures. I think in the end it worked out for the Baltics, but I don't think it was predetermined. And the same with Belarus being, for example, the closest vassal. Is that overdetermined by some sort of history, or is there a political trajectory contingency here? So we want to understand these processes, and we're thinking that some of the variables that we identify as really important from the Russia-Ukraine case are probably generalizable more broadly. So we're thinking, for example, of identity conception distance between and what we mean here is sort of the difference between how a given country conceptualizes its identity and the way in which Russia conceptualizes that country's identity. And if there is a big, we think that one of the sources of conflict and one of the sources of this escalatory cycle is when there's a really big disconnect with how identity is conceived in the independent state and how Russia conceives that country's identity. And if there is a big difference, that creates the tension in which Russia seeks to somehow alter that identity conception through some sort of pressure. And if that pressure fails, then the methods of applying this pressure escalate to military means. But also the escalatory cycle suggests that once that pressure is applied, the identity conception distance only grows. It doesn't, in fact, get bridged. So that's one thing, one variable to consider. Another variable to consider is regime divergence, sort of to think about. In a way, this is our way of sort of checking some of the arguments that are also sort of influential in trying to explain the Russia-Ukraine war, this idea that Russia's attack on Ukraine is primarily motivated by regime insecurity by Putin, and sort of the desire to launch invasions in order to keep popularity up at home. I think that's something to explore further. I think it's there's mixed evidence, it seems to us, in that area, because there are some cases in which Russia does not seem to react in the same way to regime divergence. We're thinking Armenian regime divergence after Pashinyan comes to power doesn't necessarily trigger the same response as Ukrainian regime divergence. So is it that Russia is somehow not in the same way fearful of Armenian democracy than it is of Ukrainian democracy? Why would that be? I mean, that's something I think to explore further, and also to think about who the geopolitical competitor is for the different cases. That it's one thing when the geopolitical competitor is Europe and the West, and perhaps a different dynamic if the geopolitical competitor is China or Iran. And so that's something to consider as well. And of course, at this point, if we're going to take this across many cases, the international environment we think comes in not necessarily in terms of sort of this wrangling between Russia and the West, but in terms of how permissive the international environment is of a Russian attack on a given country. You know, how easy does it seem to Russia to launch an invasion of Georgia or Moldova versus an invasion of the Baltics, who are in the or Poland, who are in the EU and in NATO? It's a different kind of situation. So it has to be, that also has to be incorporated somehow in the model. But as I say, we're sort of in the early stages of this process. So hopefully by APSA at the end of the summer, we'll have something more concrete to be sharing with audiences.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. And well, the prospects of your research and your future plans also make me think about the future scenarios that we can draw based on your based on your research and the escalatory cycle theory. And could you tell us something about this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the line that we're thinking in, that I think we need to do this work now because especially given the American pivot, if Russia manages to snatch some sort of partial victory in Ukraine because of U.S. help, it's going to come out emboldened from this international situation. I mean, that's where the permissiveness comes in. If there's a sort of a signal coming from a very disunited and sort of crumbling Western alliance because of these fissures that are emerging between the US and its European allies, and American threats to Canada and whatnot. All of this creates a permissive environment for Russia to push its interests further beyond Ukraine. And then we really need to understand these relationships between Russia and the different countries in order to have a better grip at where to expect another attack or intervention. Because I think if we continue with the IR and the realist lens, for example, it will be clear that what their prediction is, that Russia will attack the weakest because it will be the easiest. And so, maybe the first then the first target is Moldova because it's small and not in NATO, not in the EU. But I think we really, I mean, it's a reasonable guess to be making, but I think we really need to understand the dynamic in the bilateral relations in order to understand what would Russia be most motivated to go after in order to rebuild this in order to push forward on the re-imperialization. I mean, it seems that if we look at Russian regime rhetoric right now, I mean, they don't talk about Moldova all that much. The focus is on destabilizing Europe, figuring out a way to bring down European democracies, figuring out a way to infiltrate, to have these actors in various in EU democracies that are going to do Russia's bidding, breaking up NATO, breaking up the European Union, reestablishing a much broader area of domination and control. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think of this process as a territorial expansion process that is driven by Russia's desire to add small pieces of territory incrementally, which would suggest, taking Transnistria and Moldova if they're after territory. But if we think that the goal here is the expansion of Russia's reach in Europe through domination and through basically a grab for the sovereignty of some of these countries rather than their territory, then that implies a very different strategy, and it implies different targets. And then suddenly, it may seem that the targets are in fact Hungary, and and Romania rather than Moldova or Georgia. I mean, although in Georgia they've made a lot of progress already in establishing a vassal puppet government, but so that's I think that's why we think this avenue of research will be important, because it will help us understand sort of where things are going to go next. Oh, I don't know if my connection frozen, or Alexandra's?
One moment. Alexandra have a problem with internet, I think,
Yeah.
because tak, so one moment. If somebody have ask, I think that we write on the chat or thinking about us, because I thinking that we step by step finish, yes, so maybe.
Yeah.
But yes, Alexandra, yes.
And sorry, unfortunately, I lost the connection. But
Yeah.
anyway, thank you very much, Faria, for your insights, for sharing your research with us. And now we can open the floor to the audience. We still have almost an hour to go. So please raise your hand, and then you will be able to ask your question or voice your comments. You can also ask the questions in the chat if you prefer. If there's no questions so far, then maybe I will add something from myself, because what I've noticed in what you were talking about, the Russia, and in the book as well, about Russia basically revising history and kind of revising geography, and consequently the attempts to revise someone else's territory by territorial grab, and the identity by basically, well, talking to Ukraine, saying to these other countries, including Ukraine, who they are and how they should conceptualize their memory and their vision for the future, I start to think that actually Russia does the same thing as, for example, the terrorist networks and violent actors such as ISIS or Al Qaeda, whose activity also was strongly influenced by the goal to, well, to kind of push the West towards, well, to show the West that they don't tolerate Western identity, Western approach to, well, organizing the social life, and in the vision of the individual, etc. Some ways is doing, well, is the same, is in some ways is also contesting the
So
Yeah.
yes,
I mean,
yes.
I can let's wait for her to be able to log in so that she can hear my response to this.
Okay, maybe one moment to
Sure.
Alexandra come back.
Again, I'm not sure. Did you hear my question?
Yeah, I did. So I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes of in the run up to 22 was to think of Putin's regime as non-ideological, and to think of him as simply maximizing the probability of remaining in power, maximizing corruption rents, and sort of arguing that that's the only goals that he has as a regime. And of course, the main figures in the Russian opposition also very much sort of promoted this idea that all that Putin is after is money and power, domestic power, and has no ideology. I think in the last 3 years we've come to realize gradually that in fact he is very much driven by ideology, and a very extremist ideology, and a very well developed one. Not to say by well developed that it has deep roots in facts. It's a certain interpretation of historical facts, but well developed in the sense that it is deep enough that it gives him positions and opinions that he's very strongly attached to on a whole host of questions. It's not just an opinion that Ukraine belongs to Russia. It's a much broader historical narrative, and also a much broader political ideology focused on basically what can be called traditional values, but with a deep sort of grounding in Russian history, and that's an ideological project that guides his policies, and I think we need to be clear-eyed about this.
I, oh,
Yeah, it's too bad. I think Alexandra's connection is not
big
cooperating.
problem. Yes, big
But
problem.
if everything is recorded, she can hear the the answers.
Yeah, maybe somebody have asked another question, because now we have the wait for Alexander. Or maybe to sum up, maybe to
Yeah.
to better to start sum up, and after maybe if Alexander to sum up, yes, maybe you start, yes.
Sure. I mean, I think we'll basically have to think about these issues for the next few years, because as we argue in the book, even if Putin were to be gone from the political scene tomorrow, this is a confrontation and a problem that is deeper than Putin and his regime. And if there will be sort of domestic change within Russia, it will be a long process towards de-imperialization. We know from other empires that this is very difficult to go through that process and to let go of the idea that you're entitled to your imperial possessions. That usually starts from a defeat, but in this case, it seems that Russian military defeat in Ukraine is not very likely. So as a result, what we're going to have to deal with would be an equally committed, maybe even emboldened Russia on its imperial quest. And so Europe will have to deal with it and sort of brainstorm ways to contain and to defend for the near future, for sure.
Mhm. So we can observe Russia-Ukraine war, and we have a good uh, and maybe future it will be better. Yes. So another. So thank you very much, Professor Popova. Thank you very much, everyone. Of course, I invite you on the another seminars, the Richard Pipes Laboratory. So, and today, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for having me.